You picked the wrong county to try that in tonight. Ma'am, hands where I can
Her
see 'em.
hands had not moved. They were already where he could see them.
Caller states subject has been loitering near the beer cooler for approximately 20 minutes.
Yeah, that's her, standing right there.
You hear that, ma'am? That's you they're talking about.
Look at her. Just standing there like she ow.
I asked for identification.
He had not, in fact, asked. Not yet.
Ma'am, I'm not going to ask you
Across
again.
the 4-lane, a black Suburban sat with its engine off. 2 men inside had not yet opened the doors.
If you've ever stood at a pump you already paid for and felt the air change around you, this story is for you.
To understand what happened at Pump 4, you have to rewind about 40 minutes to the stretch of interstate that runs through Halifax County like a long gray seam. The woman at the pump had been driving for 2 hours by then, alone, without music. She had told the 2 men who normally shadowed her from a car length back that she wanted an hour of quiet before she reached her father's house, and they had, after a pause that the older of them made deliberately long, agreed to hold at a distance she could not see. Her name was Naomi Whitfield. What she was, what her title read, what the plate on the car she had left in the garage that morning actually said, none of that had gotten out of the driveway with her tonight. She had put on the plainest clothes she owned, dark jeans, a soft gray cotton pullover with the sleeves pushed to the elbows, sneakers that had walked more miles than any of the shoes lined up in the hall closet back home. Her hair was pulled back at the nape of her neck with a fabric band, and she wore no earrings, no watch, nothing on her wrists or fingers that would catch light. She had done this drive once a month for the last 11 months. Her father was 79 and had been declining in slow, patient increments since a fall the previous November, and she had learned that showing up to see him with a caravan behind her turned the visit into something he did not want and something the neighbors talked about for a week after. So tonight she had negotiated, and tonight the detail was holding back at a length that let her breathe. She had not planned to stop. Her tank was still above a quarter, and Weldon was 30 minutes further. But somewhere between exit 173 and exit 171, she had passed a green highway sign for a road she remembered, and the memory had come with a specific smell of biscuits and cheap coffee and diesel that belonged to a place her father used to stop when she was small. She had signaled and taken the exit before she finished deciding. The gas station sat where she remembered it sitting, on the east side of the frontage road, though the sign on the pole was for a different chain now, and the biscuit place next door had been replaced by a nail salon that was already closed. She pulled in at Pump 4, because Pump 4 was the only one that faced away from the road, and she stepped out into a light rain that had already stopped by the time she reached the door. Inside, the store smelled the way every store like this had ever smelled. Fried food an hour past its shelf life, floor wax, the sour edge of a mop bucket that had not been changed since the shift before. A young man behind the counter looked up from a phone and then did not look back down. He was in his early 20s, thin, with a name tag that read Floyd and a shirt collar that had been buttoned too tight against the neck. He watched her walk the length of the middle aisle to the coffee station in the back. She poured a medium into a paper cup, added 1 packet of raw sugar, and stirred the coffee twice with a wooden stick. Her eyes moved once across the ceiling to where a small dark hemisphere marked the location of the store camera, and then across the back wall to the emergency exit, and then to the door of the restroom, and then back to the counter. And this small survey took her about 2 seconds and would have been invisible to anyone who was not looking for it. She was not looking for anything. She was doing what she had done in every unfamiliar room since she was 19, which was locating the exits without knowing she was locating them. She walked back up the front aisle, set the coffee on the counter, and asked for a receipt for exactly the coffee, No other purchase. The clerk rang it up without speaking. $2.11. He handed her the receipt with 2 fingers, as if the paper were slightly damp. He looked at her forehead when he handed it to her, not at her eyes. She thanked him. She stepped outside. In the parking lot, a woman in her 50s was leaning against the driver's door of a white USV, phone pressed to her ear, cigarette between 2 fingers of the same hand that held the phone. She wore a cream cardigan over a floral blouse, and the wedding ring on her left hand was the kind that catches light from a distance. Her name was Heather Vance, and she was the wife of Halifax County Commissioner, and she was mid-sentence when Naomi came out of the store.
Somebody, Heather Vance was saying into the phone, has to be the eyes for this county, because the good Lord knows the deputies won't be. She said this at a volume that was neither a whisper nor a shout, but that carried across a parking lot the way a person's voice carries when they want to be overheard without being caught overhearing themselves. Her eyes met Naomi's for the length of a breath. She did not look away. She lifted her chin half an inch. Naomi kept walking. She did not slow, did not speed up, did not turn her head. She walked past the ice freezer, past the propane cage, past the yellow bollards at the end of the walk, and she stopped at pump 4 with her sneakers on the painted line and set her coffee on the roof of the sedan and reached for her wallet. At the corner of her eye, taped to the light pole beside the pump, was the store's posted trespass and loitering notice. She had not registered it on the way in. She registered it now. She lifted her phone out of her back pocket, opened the camera, and took one steady photograph of the notice. The photograph included the statute reference printed at the bottom of the notice in the smallest legible font, which read North Carolina General Statutes, Section 14-159.13, second-degree trespass. And it noted below that entry that no person could be found in violation without prior notice and refusal to leave. She lowered the phone. She did not look at the woman by the SUV. She swiped her card. She lifted the nozzle. She began to pump. Inside the store, the clerk picked up the landline behind the counter and dialed 911. The call would later be released in the discovery packet with a duration of 1 minute and 47 seconds. In it, the clerk's voice sounded higher than it had sounded across the counter. He said the same thing 3 times in 3 slightly different ways. There was a woman by the beer cooler. She had been there 20 minutes. She matched a description. He did not want his name on the report. When the operator asked what the woman had done, there was a pause of 4 full seconds, and then the clerk said he thought she had put something in her pocket. And then he said he was not sure, but he was pretty sure. And then he asked how long until someone got there. The operator dispatched a unit at 9:43 p.m. The unit that responded was already 3 miles up the frontage road, which was closer than dispatch had expected, and the deputy took the call because the deputy always took the calls off that particular exit. His name was Brick Halloran. He was 36 years old. He had been with the Halifax County Sheriff's Office for 8 years. He had 2 commendations in his file and 4 internal affairs referrals that had been closed at intake. His cruiser rolled up on pump 4 at 9:46 p.m., 46 seconds, with the lights off. He preferred to arrive without lights, he said in his own reports, that lights created a defensive posture in the subject, and he preferred to control the posture himself. He stepped out of the cruiser. He walked toward pump 4. He said what he said. Naomi Whitfield lowered the nozzle back into the cradle and turned to face him. "Ma'am, keep your hands where I can see them." The deputy did not say hello. He did not say his name. He did not say the reason for the stop before he gave the order. He crossed the last 6 feet of concrete between the cruiser and the pump with his right hand on the baton and his left hand slightly raised, palm out, as if she were the one moving toward him and he were the one holding ground. Naomi did not raise her hands. She did not lower them either. She kept them exactly where they had been, loose at her sides, palms turned slightly outward, fingers relaxed.
She said, in a voice that carried no more edge than the voice she had ordered coffee, that her hands were visible. The deputy stopped about 4 feet from her. He looked her over from the sneakers up. He took his time on the sneakers. He took his time on the pullover. He did not look at her face until the last, and when he looked at her face, he did not look at her eyes. He looked at her forehead, exactly the way the clerk had looked at her forehead when he handed her the receipt.
He asked her for identification. She asked him, without heat, what the stop was for. He said he was responding to a call. She asked what call. He said a shoplifting complaint. She said she had bought a coffee, that she had a receipt in her pocket, and that she was pumping gas she had paid for at the pump, and that she was standing in a place customers were expected to stand. She said none of this quickly. She said all of it the way a person reads a phone number aloud. He said the call was not about the coffee. He said the call was about her being in the store for 20 minutes. She said she had been in the store for less than 3 minutes, and that the camera above the coffee station would show that, and that if he cared to ask the clerk to pull the timestamp, he could confirm it in about 30 seconds. He said he was not asking the clerk anything. He was asking her for identification. And he said one more time that he needed her hands where he could see them. Her hands had not moved. She asked him, again without heat, under what statute he was requiring her to produce identification. She said the North Carolina Stop and Identify provision under Section 15A-401 required an articulable suspicion of a specific criminal act, and she said the posted trespass notice on the pole beside the pump required prior notice and refusal to leave under Section 14-159.13, and she said neither of those had happened. The deputy did not answer the question she had asked. He answered a different one. He said that in his experience, people who quoted statutes in a parking lot were usually the ones with something to hide. Behind him, 40 feet away, Heather Vance had lifted her phone from her ear and turned the camera on. She was recording now. She had not stopped talking to whoever was on the other end of the call. She had simply moved the phone from her ear to eye level and kept the line open so that her narration to the person on the phone was also being narrated to the camera lens. "Look at how she's just standing there," Heather Vance said, at a volume that carried. "Look at how she thinks she can talk down to him. This is what they teach them now. This is exactly what they teach them." Naomi Whitfield did not look at her. She kept her eyes on the deputy's belt line, not on his face, and not on his hands, on the belt line, which was the place a person looked when they were tracking what a person's hands might do next, without appearing to look at the hands themselves. The deputy took one step closer. He said he was going to ask one more time. He said if she did not produce identification, he was going to detain her for investigation. She said she was happy to answer questions. She said she was declining to consent to a search. She said if he was detaining her, she was requesting to be told, on the record, what she was being detained for. Subscribe now, because what happened in the next 4 minutes between that pump and the door of the black Suburban across the road is the reason a state investigation is currently open in 3 separate offices. The second cruiser arrived at 9:49 p.m. It came in with lights but no siren, rolled past the diesel island, and parked at an angle that blocked the exit lane from Pump 4 back to the frontage road. The sergeant who got out of it was older than the deputy by about 15 years and moved with the economy of a man who had learned over a long career exactly how much energy each part of a shift required and refused to spend any of it early. His name was Fletcher Reeve. He had been with the sheriff's office for 22 years. He wore his sergeant's stripes on a uniform that had been pressed that morning. He did not walk directly to the pump. He walked first to the deputy, stood beside him at an angle that did not block the deputy's line of sight to the subject, and asked quietly for a status. The deputy said the subject was refusing to identify. The sergeant nodded once. He did not correct the framing.
He turned to Naomi. He said, in the tone of a man offering a reasonable option to a reasonable person, that this was a consensual encounter, that she was of course free to leave at any time she chose, but that if she chose to leave without providing identification, the deputy would be within his discretion to detain her under reasonable suspicion, pending further investigation of the complaint.
She said that was a contradiction. She said a consensual encounter she was free to leave could not, at the same moment, be an encounter she would be detained for leaving. She said the two things could not both be true. The sergeant smiled the smile of a man who had used exactly that phrasing on exactly that objection more than 100 times in his career. He said officer safety trumped preference, ma'am. She said officer safety was not a statute. Heather Vance, still filming, laughed once, a short, high laugh with no warmth in it, and said from her position by the SUV, loud enough for the phone microphone to catch, that this was what they meant when they said the good ones were leaving the profession. The clerk was in the doorway of the store now. He had propped the glass door open with his hip and was watching the pump with an expression that had shifted in the 7 minutes since he had made the call from jumpy self-satisfaction into something quieter and less certain. His right hand was still holding the store phone. He had not hung up. He was listening to the operator on the other end and not saying anything back. The sergeant asked Naomi to step away from the pump. She stepped away from the pump, 2 paces. She stopped where he indicated. She kept her hands visible. The deputy asked her if she was carrying anything on her person that he needed to know about before he conducted a pat-down for officer's safety. She said she did not consent to a pat-down. She said her hands had been in his view since the moment he stepped out of the cruiser, and his stated basis for the encounter, which was a shoplifting complaint that could be resolved by pulling 3 minutes of interior camera footage from a store standing 10 feet from where they were currently standing, did not extend to a search of her person. The deputy said he was not asking her consent. He unhooked the handcuffs from his belt. The clerk in the doorway of the store took a step back into the store. Heather Vance took a step forward. The sergeant did not move. Somewhere in Naomi Whitfield's back pocket, the phone that she had not reached for since the moment the deputy said his first word to her began to vibrate. It vibrated once, twice, 3 times, and stopped. It was a call, not a message. The screen, if anyone had been able to see it, would have shown 2 letters and 1 number. She did not reach for it. Across the 4-lane, in the gravel lot of the shuttered barbecue restaurant, the driver's door of the black Suburban opened. A man stepped out. He was in his late 40s, tall, wearing dark slacks and a dark half-zip pullover with a small emblem stitched at the chest that read nothing to anyone standing at Pump 4. He did not shut the door behind him. He looked once across the road, once at the Suburban's passenger seat, and then he began to walk toward the frontage road at a pace that was neither hurried nor slow. The passenger door opened. The second man stepped out. At Pump 4, the deputy told Naomi Whitfield to turn around and put her hands behind her. She turned around. She put her hands behind her. She did not speak. She did not resist. She lowered her chin half an inch and looked at a point on the concrete about 18 inches in front of her sneakers, and she did what her father had taught her to do the first time he had explained to her, when she was 9 years old, what she should do if this ever happened, which was, do not give them a reason, do not give them a story, do not give them anything they can use, and if it happens anyway, remember what you were wearing, remember what they said, remember what time it was. Remember every single face. The first cuff went on her right wrist. The click was quiet. It was the sound of a small mechanical thing doing exactly what it was designed to do. The second cuff went on her left wrist. The deputy pulled it slightly tighter than he needed to. He clicked it 1 extra tooth past where it had already caught. He did this on purpose. He would later say in his report that the cuffs had been applied per department standard. He would not mention the extra click. Heather Vance said softly into her phone, "Oh my, look at that.
Look at her just letting it happen. The sergeant, standing 3 feet behind the deputy, said nothing. The clerk, in the doorway of the store, put the receiver of the store phone down on the counter without saying goodbye to the operator on the other end.
At the edge of the frontage road, the first man from the Suburban stopped at the painted line where the gas station apron ended and the shoulder began. He did not step onto the apron. He was waiting for the pass of a single truck heading north. His right hand, held loosely at his side, was resting on something clipped to his belt at hip level. Whatever it was small, and it was flat, and it was not a weapon. The truck passed. He stepped onto the apron. The second man was 2 paces behind him. At pump 4, the deputy took Naomi Whitfield's right elbow in his left hand and began to turn her toward the cruiser. If you want to know what the man walking across that apron said when he reached pump 4, hit subscribe now and stay for part 2, because what he said stopped the arrest in 9 words. The deputy did not see him yet. The deputy was looking at the back of Naomi Whitfield's head, at the fabric band that held her hair, at the tag of her pullover that had folded up slightly against her neck. He was walking her toward the rear passenger door of the cruiser, at the pace a person walks a subject to a cruiser when they intend to be photographed doing it later. The sergeant saw him first. The sergeant saw him at about the same moment the first man's boots left the painted line of the shoulder and touched the poured concrete of the apron. And the sergeant did what a sergeant with 22 years does when a variable enters the scene that he did not put on the scene himself. He shifted his weight to his back foot. He moved his right hand from his hip to the front of his belt, where it rested empty on the buckle. He said quietly, "Deputy." The deputy did not hear him. The sergeant said it again, louder, "Deputy, hold." The deputy stopped walking. He turned his head. He saw the 2 men. He did not at first understand what he was seeing. 2 men in dark clothes walking across an empty gas station apron at 9:50 p.m. on a Tuesday was not, by itself, a category his training had a fast answer for. He assessed threat. He assessed distance. He kept his left hand on Naomi Whitfield's elbow. He kept his right hand near his belt. The first man stopped about 8 feet from the cruiser. He did not raise his hands. He did not lower them. He held them exactly where Naomi Whitfield had held her hands 3 minutes earlier, which was loose at his sides, palms slightly forward. He looked at the deputy. He did not look at Naomi Whitfield yet. He looked at the deputy first. He said in a voice that was not raised, that was not soft, that was pitched exactly to carry across 8 feet of wet concrete and no further, that the deputy needed to step away from the subject. The deputy said, "Who are you, and what is your business here?" The first man reached, slowly, with 2 fingers of his right hand, to the small flat object clipped to his belt at hip level. He unclipped it. He held it out at chest height, folded shut, and then he opened it with a small, deliberate motion of his thumb. Inside the fold was a badge and a photo card. The badge caught the light from the overhead fluorescence once, briefly, and the light that came off it was gold. The first man said 9 words. He said them at the same conversational volume he had used to say his name. He said, "Deputy, step away from Governor Whitfield. Right now." The cuffs on Naomi Whitfield's wrists caught the same overhead light the badge had caught, from a different angle, and for 1 long second, no one at pump 4 moved. The lock on the store's front glass door clicked once and did not click again. The name landed in the deputy's ear before it landed in his face. For about 2 seconds after the man from the Suburban finished the sentence, the deputy's expression did not change. He was still holding Naomi Whitfield's right elbow in his left hand. His right hand was still near the grip of the baton. The cuffs on her wrists were still catching the overhead light. His mouth was slightly open in the shape of a follow-up question he had already begun to form when the 9 words interrupted him. Then the sentence caught up with him. His left hand loosened on her elbow. It did not release.
It loosened. He looked down at the badge and photo card the man was still holding open at chest height, and he read the top line of the credential, and he read the bottom line of the credential, and then his eyes flicked to the man's face, and then to the man behind that man, and then to the sergeant, and then finally, for the first time since he had stepped out of the cruiser, to Naomi Whitfield's face. He looked at her eyes. She looked at his forehead. She did not speak. The sergeant, 3 feet back, took one slow step forward and said the deputy's name at the volume of a man handing a live wire to someone who had not yet realized it was live. The deputy's left hand came off her elbow entirely. His right hand moved away from the baton and hung at his side, and then it moved to his belt to unclip the ring of keys that held the cuff key. The man from the Suburban did not lower the badge yet. He kept it open. He said, at the same conversational volume he had used for everything since he stepped onto the apron, that he was going to ask the sergeant to step away from the cruiser and to keep the deputy in his line of sight, and he was going to ask the deputy to unlock the cuffs on the governor's wrists using his non-dominant hand, and he was going to ask everyone else on the apron to remain exactly where they were until state law enforcement arrived, which would be inside of 6 minutes. The sergeant stepped away from the cruiser. The deputy unlocked the cuffs with his left hand. The cuff on the left wrist came off first. The one on the right wrist came off second. He clicked them shut on themselves before he clipped them back to his belt, the way a person does when they have done that motion 10,000 times and their hands do it without them. The second man from the Suburban was at Naomi Whitfield's side by then. He did not touch her. He stood at her left shoulder, at the distance a person stands when they are placing themselves between someone and everything else in a parking lot. He said her name once, softly, and asked her a single question that was 2 words long, which was, "Are you?" She said she was. He nodded once, and then he did not say anything else. Heather Vance, 30 feet away, had lowered the phone. She was still holding it in her hand at hip level, but the camera was pointed to the concrete now. The person on the other end of her call had, at some point in the last 90 seconds, started asking her questions she was not answering. She turned slightly so that her back was mostly to the pump. The clerk was no longer in the doorway of the store. He had stepped back inside behind the counter and put his hand on the store phone, and then, after a moment, taken it off the store phone without picking it up. If you have made it this far, hit that like button. The receipts you are about to hear are the reason a federal review is currently open on the Halifax County Sheriff's Office.
The man from the Suburban was Carter Mercer. He had been the shift commander of the Executive Protection Detail for 3 years. He and his partner had been sitting in the Suburban across the 4-lane since the moment Naomi Whitefield had signaled off the interstate at the last exit, because sitting where they could see her without her being able to see them is what she had asked for, and it was also, technically, exactly what the Standing Operations Manual required them to do. Mercer would later explain, in a written statement that was included in the SBI file at page 47, that the moment he had seen a Halifax County cruiser pull up to Pump 4 without lights, he had contacted the state duty officer on a secured channel. The duty officer had contacted the State Highway Patrol. The State Highway Patrol had contacted the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation. By the time Mercer had opened the driver's door of the Suburban, an SBI supervisory special agent named Daniel Frazier had already been in his own car and on the frontage road, 7 minutes out. Frazier arrived at 10:13 p.m. He arrived without lights. He parked on the shoulder, walked across the apron, greeted Mercer with a single nod, greeted Naomi Whitefield with a single nod, and asked the sergeant, whose name he already knew from the duty officer's briefing, to identify himself for the record. The sergeant identified himself. Frazier asked the deputy, whose name he also already knew, to identify himself for the record. The deputy identified himself.
Frazier asked both of them to remain on the apron and to make no attempt to communicate with the store, with dispatch, or with the second civilian who was now sitting in the white SUV pretending to be on a different phone call. Both of them nodded. Frazier asked to see the deputy's body-worn camera. The deputy unclipped it from the front of his uniform and handed it to Frazier. Frazier held it up to the light for a moment, checked the small green indicator, and asked the deputy to confirm on the record what time he had activated the device that evening. The deputy said he had activated it upon arrival at the scene. Frazier asked what time upon arrival was. The deputy said 9:46 p.m. Frazier did not respond to that. He clipped the camera into an evidence bag, sealed it in front of the sergeant, and signed the seal. He would later note in his investigative summary that the internal metadata on the device would show activation at 9:47 p.m., 46 seconds, 1 full minute and 46 seconds after the deputy had gotten out of the cruiser and given his first command. The gap was 1 minute and 46 seconds. The record would call it a 4-minute gap later in the newspaper. Frazier would explain, patiently, more than once, that the 4-minute number came from the delta between the dispatch time of the call and the beginning of the surviving footage. The actual missing period of officer conduct was closer to 2 minutes, and its meaning was disputed, and its cause was at the time of writing still under review. At 10:27 p.m., Naomi Whitefield was seated in the passenger seat of the black Suburban with the door open and a bottle of water in her hand. She had made 2 phone calls. The first, 40 seconds long, was to her father's nurse, to whom she said only that she was going to be later than she had planned and that everything was fine. The second, 1 minute and 11 seconds long, was to Ezra Blake, the Attorney General of the state of North Carolina, who had already been briefed by the SBI duty officer and who told her before she asked that the civil rights and public integrity sections of his office would open a file that night.
By 11:15 p.m., the store was closed. The clerk had been taken to the Halifax County substation for a witness interview, not as a subject, and had asked twice on the way out of the door whether he was in trouble. By 11:47 p.m., Heather Vance had been driven home in her own SUV by a state highway patrol trooper because the SBI had asked her, politely, not to drive herself. By 1:12 a.m., the Halifax County Sheriff's Office had received a formal notice that Deputy Brick Halloran and Sergeant Fletcher Reeve had been placed on paid administrative leave pending investigation. The notice used the phrase pending investigation. It did not use any of the more specific phrases that were available to it. By 8:15 a.m. the following day, the story had a headline. The reporter who wrote the first headline was named Candace Morris. She was a 14-year veteran of a mid-sized North Carolina daily and had, coincidentally, been one of the reporters on the campaign bus during Naomi Whitefield's first run for Attorney General 9 years earlier. She had a source in the governor's office who had a name in her contacts as CM, and CM had sent her 3 text messages between 1 and 2 in the morning. Morris had spent the next 4 hours on the phone with the SBI, with the governor's press secretary, with Sheriff Otis Cronin's after-hours contact, and with a former Halifax County deputy who had left the office in 2023 under conditions the deputy would only describe, off the record, as familiar. Cronin's actual statement came at 10 a.m. the same morning on the front steps of the Halifax County Courthouse, standing beside his union representative and a printed statement he read once without deviation. He said that his deputy had responded in good faith to a 911 call from a store owner who had reported a possible shoplifting in progress. He said his deputy had followed procedure. He said the Halifax County Sheriff's Office had cooperated fully with state investigators and would continue to do so. He said the citizens of Halifax County could have complete confidence in the professionalism of their deputies. He did not take questions. He did not, at any point in the statement, use Naomi Whitefield's name.
The paid administrative leave was announced at 11:40 a.m. Halloran's leave was described in the release as pending review. Reeves was described in the release as pending review of supervisory response. The two phrases were not the same phrase. The dispatch call, released under a public records request 11 days later, ran 1 minute and 47 seconds and included the passage in which the clerk, when asked what the subject had actually done, paused for 4 full seconds before saying he thought she had put something in her pocket, and then, after another pause, that he was not sure. The store's interior camera footage, released as part of the discovery packet in the criminal case months afterward, ran 2 minutes and 48 seconds from the moment Naomi Whitefield entered the store to the moment she left it. It contained no interaction between Naomi Whitefield and the beer cooler. It contained no interaction between Naomi Whitefield and any product on any shelf other than the coffee pump. It contained 1 interaction with the counter and 1 interaction with the clerk, both of which were the coffee purchase. Heather Vance's cell phone footage, obtained by subpoena 3 weeks later, contained an unrelated call in progress that overlapped with the incident for 6 minutes and 11 seconds, and in the first 13 seconds of that call, before she had turned the camera on, her side of the conversation included the sentence, "I already called it in. They should be here any minute now."
She had not made the 911 call. She had told someone she had. The someone she had told was, per phone records subpoenaed the following month, Sheriff Otis Cronin's personal cell phone. The call from her phone to his had lasted 8 minutes and 2 seconds and had begun approximately 11 minutes before the clerk picked up the store landline. Sheriff Cronin, when asked about this call in a follow-up interview with the SBI conducted at his office 6 weeks later, said on the record and in the presence of his attorney that he did not recall the substance of the conversation. He said Mrs. Vance was a constituent and a friend of the office, and that constituents called him about a variety of matters. He said he did not, at any point during that phone call, direct any deputy to respond to any location. He was not asked in that interview whether he had suggested that a call be made. He was asked that question later by a federal grand jury. 6 months after the night at Pump 4, Deputy Brick Halloran was indicted by a federal grand jury seated in the Eastern District of North Carolina on 1 count of deprivation of rights under color of law in violation of Title 18 United States Code, Section 242. The indictment alleged that Halloran had, willfully and under color of the authority of the Halifax County Sheriff's Office, deprived Naomi Whitfield of the right to be free from unreasonable seizure protected by the Fourth Amendment. The indictment did not include a charge of hate crime enhancement. The prosecutors would say later, off the record, that they had considered the enhancement and had elected not to include it because the evidentiary standard for the enhancement was higher than the evidentiary standard for the base offense, and they preferred to bring the charge they could prove. Halloran pleaded not guilty at his arraignment before a United States magistrate judge in Raleigh. He was released on his own recognizance pending trial. His attorney was paid for by the Southern States Fraternal Order of Police Legal Defense Fund. His attorney requested and received 3 continuances over the following 7 months. Trial was set for a date 14 months after the indictment. 9 months after the indictment, Halloran's attorney entered into plea negotiations with the United States Attorney's Office. 2 months after that, Halloran pleaded guilty to a lesser-included offense with a stipulated sentence of 1 year of federal probation, 200 hours of community service, permanent decertification as a law enforcement officer in the state of North Carolina, and a written statement of responsibility that was read aloud at sentencing and that included the phrase, "I acted on assumptions I should not have made, and I caused harm I cannot undo." He did not name Naomi Whitfield in the statement. He did not name Heather Vance in the statement.
He was sentenced by a United States district judge to the stipulated sentence plus a fine of $5,000 plus a condition of supervised release that prohibited him from applying for any position in state or municipal government for a period of 5 years. The community service requirement was completed at a food bank in Rocky Mount. Sergeant Fletcher Reeve was not indicted. The grand jury declined to return a true bill against him after 11 ballots. The United States Attorney's Office declined to seek a superseding indictment. Reeve was returned to duty 6 months later after completing 40 hours of departmental retraining on constitutional stop and identify procedures, and was reassigned from the road to the courthouse security detail, where he remained for the 14 months preceding his retirement. Floyd Landry, the clerk, was charged in Halifax County District Court with 1 count of filing a false police report under North Carolina General Statutes, Section 14-225. He entered a no-contest plea. He received a suspended sentence of 45 days, 12 months of unsupervised probation, and a fine of $200. He worked subsequently at a warehouse in Roanoke Rapids.
Heather Vance was not charged. The North Carolina Attorney General's Office, in a memorandum dated 8 months after the incident, concluded that while her phone call to Sheriff Cronin was inappropriate and possibly improper, the statutory elements for a charge of solicitation of false report could not be met on the available evidence. Her husband, the county commissioner, did not run for re-election the following year. Sheriff Otis Cronin ran for re-election 14 months after the incident. He lost the Democratic primary by approximately 11 percentage points to a former county magistrate named Josiah Carter, who ran on a platform that included, among other planks, mandatory activation of body-worn cameras at the initiation of any contact with a member of the public, established a rebuttable presumption against the officer's testimony in any case in which the required footage was unavailable, and created an independent review office within the State Bureau of Investigation with subpoena power over department servers. It passed the state Senate by a margin of 3 votes. Naomi Whitfield signed it in her office on a Wednesday morning at 11 a.m., with her father seated in a wheelchair beside the desk and with Halloran Mercer standing at the far wall. She did not, in the concession speech, mention the gas station. She mentioned it once at a private dinner 4 months after that, when someone at the table asked whether she had known at Pump 4 that the 2 men in the Suburban were watching. She looked at the person who had asked and said only, "I always know they're there. That is the point." If this story mattered to you, subscribe now, because the last 2 threads of it were never tied off, and both of them are still open in the file.
The first was the gap in the body-worn camera footage. The department's internal review, conducted by the sergeant who took over Reeves' role during his administrative leave, concluded that the gap was consistent with a device that had been powered on but not placed in active recording mode until the moment of the arrival at the scene, which was, per department policy at the time, the officer's discretion. The SBI's parallel review reached a different conclusion, which was that the metadata on the device showed a manual pause of approximately 1 minute and 42 seconds, initiated from the device itself in the seconds immediately following the deputy's exit from the cruiser. The 2 conclusions were incompatible. The device, subpoenaed by federal prosecutors, was examined by a forensic technician at the FBI's Charlotte field office. The technician's report, dated 11 months after the incident, was included in the case file under seal. Halloran's plea deal did not require him to explain the gap. The federal prosecutors did not ask him to explain it. The gap, at the time of writing, has not been explained. The second was an email. The email was one of 47 internal communications obtained by Candace Morris under a public records request filed the week after the incident. 46 of the 47 were released in full.
The 47th was released with the entire body of the message redacted and only the header visible. The header read as follows: From sender withheld under exemption. To sender withheld under exemption. Date 14 months prior to the incident. Subject line: I-95 corridor stops, Q2 numbers, per your request. The exemption cited for the redaction was the personnel file exemption under North Carolina General Statutes, Section 132-1.4a. Morris's attorney filed an administrative appeal. The appeal was denied. Morris's newspaper filed suit for the release of the unredacted document in Wake County Superior Court. The suit was consolidated with two similar suits and remained pending at the time of writing on the court's docket. The subject line was the only part of the email that anyone outside the Halifax County Sheriff's Office had ever read. It was enough to know that the request had been made. It was not enough to know who had made it. And in the parking lot of a shuttered gas station off exit 171 on a Tuesday night in September that would be referenced eventually by month and year and not by any specific date, the concrete had been power washed twice. The pump had been replaced. The camera above the coffee station had been upgraded. The store had reopened under new management with a new name. The trespass notice on the light pole beside Pump 4 had been reprinted at some point on cleaner paper. The statute citation at the bottom of it had not changed. It still read in the smallest legible font, North Carolina General Statutes, Section 14-159.13, second-degree trespass, requiring notice and refusal to leave. It had always required that. It always would.